What comes to mind when you think of Prussia? Strict discipline, shiny uniforms and powerful generals? Or reforms, education and the rise of a modern state? Hardly any other historical name evokes such contrasting images. Prussia was a driving force in Europe for centuries, admired, feared, misunderstood. From an inconspicuous area in the east, a power developed that waged wars, shifted borders and finally played a decisive role in the formation of Germany. But was Prussia really just a military state? Or was it also a motor for progress, administration, tolerance and enlightenment? Before we dive into this story together, I'm interested in your opinion. Was Prussia more of an opportunity for Europe, or a danger? Be sure to write your assessment in the comments below. I'm curious to see how you see it. If you are fascinated by historical developments and want to understand how the past shapes our present, then support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any part of this journey through ascension, power, crises, and myths. And now we are starting at the very beginning, at the origins of a state that was to change Europe forever. Chapter 1: The Origins in the East. Long before the name Prussia was associated with kings, generals, and power politics, a largely unknown stretch of land of dense forests, swamps, and quiet lagoons lay in northeastern Europe. Between the Vistula and Nemunas rivers, along the rugged coast of the Baltic Sea, there were Baltic tribes that were poorly understood and often feared by their western neighbors. They did not call themselves Prussians. This name was given to them later. In the chronicles of the Middle Ages, they appear as Prussians, a pagan people with their own language, their own gods, and deep-rooted traditions. The Prussians belonged to the Baltic family of peoples, related to Lithuanians and Latvians, but they did not form a political unit. Their territory was divided into numerous gay tribal regions, each led by local leaders or elders. There was no central rule, no king, no capital. Decisions were made collectively, power was distributed, and loyalty was primarily to one's own clan. This structure made society flexible, but also vulnerable as soon as it encountered more tightly organized powers. Her life was closely connected to nature. Forests were considered sacred, as were certain groves and springs. Offerings to gods such as Perkins, the god of thunder, or other nature deities were part of everyday life. Priests, often described as pagan priests in later sources, preserved religious knowledge and led rituals. Archaeological finds prove cremations, artistically crafted jewelry, and remarkable craftsmanship. Amber, which was collected on the coasts of the Baltic Sea, played a special role. Even in ancient times, trade routes, the so-called Amber Road, led from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean region. Thus, the area was by no means isolated, but part of a wide economic network. But from the perspective of the Christian empires of the Middle Ages, the land of the Prussians was considered a peripheral zone of civilization, pagan, undeveloped, and in need of missionary work. While Christian rulers had long since established themselves in the west and south, the Baltic tribes held on to their old beliefs. In the eyes of the Church, this made them a legitimate target for mission and, if necessary, for military conversion. As early as the 10th and 11th centuries, there were isolated missionary attempts. Clergymen ventured into the area, preaching and trying to baptize local leaders. But these efforts were mostly unsuccessful or ended violently. One of the most famous early missionaries was Adalbert of Prague, who tried to convert the Prussians to Christianity in 997, and was killed in the process. For the Church he became a martyr, for the Prussians he was an intruder. Such events deepened the picture of an unruly, dangerous border area. At the same time, new political forces were gaining strength west of the Vistula. The Duchy of Poland had become Christianized and was trying to secure its borders. The princes of the Holy Roman Empire also looked with interest at the Baltic Sea. In the High Middle Ages, a phase began that later became known as the Eastern Settlement. German settlers, merchants, and craftsmen emigrated to eastern areas, founded cities, and brought new forms of administration with them. This movement was not only economically motivated, but also religiously charged. The spread of Christianity was considered a divine mandate. For the Prussians, This development meant growing pressure. Border conflicts with Christian Poland became more and more frequent. The Duchy of Mazovia in particular suffered from repeated raids and counterattacks. The border region was a space of permanent insecurity, a strip between two worlds. On the one hand, the pagan tribal societies, on the other, the increasingly centralized Christian principalities. In the early 13th century, the situation came to a head. Conrad of Mazovia, a Polish duke, was unable to permanently subjugate the Prussians or secure his borders. Several campaigns had failed. The tribal warriors knew the terrain, led quick ambushes, and retreated back into the forests. A permanent conquest seemed hardly possible with the available means. In this situation, Conrad turned to an order of knights that had originally been founded in the Holy Land, the Teutonic Order. Teutonic Order. The order was founded during the Crusades and was dedicated to the protection of pilgrims and the fight against non-Christians. After the Christian states in the Middle East had come under increasing pressure, the order was looking for new fields of activity. A mission in the Baltic Sea region promised not only religious legitimacy, but also territorial prospects. In 1226, Emperor Frederick II held out the prospect of far-reaching rights to the order in the so-called Golden Bull of Rimini if he succeeded in subjugating the territory of the Prussians. Conrad of Mazovia, in turn, promised the order land as a starting point. What began as a cry for help developed into a momentous political step. For the Teutonic Order did not only come as a military service provider, it came with a claim to its own rule. When the Knights of the Order moved into the area in the 1230s, a new era began. Unlike earlier missionary attempts, their approach was systematic, organized, and long-term. They built castles made of stone that served as military bases. From there they led campaigns against individual Prussian districts, subjugated them, and secured the conquered territory permanently. Each castle was at the same time an administrative center, a symbol of the new order and the starting point for further expansion. The fight against the Prussians dragged on for decades. Again and again there were uprisings, especially in the 1260s, when a large Prussian uprising seriously threatened the rule of the order. But in the end, the military discipline and organization of the Knights of the Order prevailed. Step by step, the old tribal structure disintegrated. Parts of the population were baptized and integrated, others fled or merged into the new society. The conquest marked the beginning of a comprehensive transformation of the country. The order specifically promoted the settlement of German farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. New cities were built according to the Western model, often with market squares, churches, and regular road networks. The so-called Culm law regulated administration and jurisdiction. A loosely organized tribal area became a tightly run religious state. But this change was profound not only politically, but also culturally. The old Prussian language disappeared over the centuries. Traditions, beliefs, and social structures were suppressed or reshaped. The name Prussia, however, remained, but now as a designation for a territory under Christian German-influenced rule. The state of the order quickly developed into one of the most powerful forces in the Baltic Sea region. Its strategic location between Central Europe and the Baltic states, access to maritime trade and military clout made it a serious player. Trading cities such as Königsberg gained in importance, and the area became part of the Hanseatic economic area. At the same time, the region remained an area of tension. The Teutonic Order came into conflict with Poland and Lithuania, which in turn expanded their power. The Christianization of Lithuania in the late 14th century deprived the order of a central reason for legitimizing further crusades. The former missionary war increasingly became a power political struggle. But all that was still in the future. In the 13th century, something fundamental had happened. A territorially organized state had emerged from the pagan settlement area of the Prussians. The foundations for what would later become Prussia were laid, not by a king, not by a national movement, but by a spiritual order of knights that combined faith, sword, and administration. What emerged here in Eastern Europe was more than just another medieval territory. It was an experiment, a state that emerged from military conquest and relied on discipline, organization, and expansion. Characteristics that were later often associated with Prussia found their early expression here. But this entity was still a religious state, religiously influenced, internationally oriented, and firmly integrated into the world of the Middle Ages. The path from the Crusader state to the secular duchy and finally to the kingdom was to take centuries. But without the violent and profound upheavals of the 13th century, this development would hardly have been conceivable. Thus, the history of Prussia does not begin with a coronation, not with a battle of European great powers, but with a cultural clash on the periphery of the world at that time, between pagan tribal societies and a Christian order of knights that had come to stay. Chapter 2: The Teutonic Order and the State of the Order. When the Knights of the Teutonic Order gained a permanent foothold on the southeastern Baltic Sea coast in the 13th century, a unique political experiment began. What arose here was no ordinary principality and no classical kingdom. It was a spiritual state, led by an order of knights that saw itself as a religious community, military elite, and administrative power at the same time. Faith and sword, prayer and strategy, mission and expansion merged into a new order that was to fundamentally change the land between the Vistula and the Nemel. The order itself was founded during the Crusades in the Holy Land. Originally founded as a hospital community for sick pilgrims, it quickly developed into a military order based on the model of the Templars and Knights of St. John. Its members took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They saw themselves as monks in armor, fighters in the service of Christ. When the balance of power in the Middle East turned against the Crusader states, the order sought new fields of activity. The Baltic Sea region offered an opportunity. Pagan people still lived here, whose conversion could be legitimized religiously. With the invitation of the Polish Duke Conrad of Mazovia, the order was given a concrete task. But a border security mission quickly turned into a comprehensive project of conquest. Unlike secular mercenaries, the Knights of the Order acted for the long term. They didn't just want to fight, they wanted to rule. The conquest of Prussian territory was systematic. Instead of uncoordinated campaigns, the order relied on a strategy of castle building and territorial security. Massive brick fortresses were built along rivers and important trade routes, defiant complexes with thick walls, chapels, storerooms, and accommodation for knights and servants. Each castle was a military base, administrative center, and symbol of the new power at the same time. From here, surrounding regions were controlled, taxes were levied, and further campaigns were prepared. The military superiority of the order was based not only on better equipment, but above all on organization. The knights were disciplined, their command structure clearly regulated. At the top was the Grand Master, elected by the leading members of the order. He was subordinate to the Landmeister and Komtur, who administered individual districts. This hierarchical structure enabled efficient management of a growing territory. At the same time, Christianization was the central goal and justification of the procedure. The baptism of the subjugated population was not only a religious act, but a political instrument. Those who were baptized formally belonged to the Christian community and were subject to the new order. Churches were built, priests were appointed, parish districts were created. But the transition was rarely peaceful. Resistance was militarily broken, uprisings bloodily suppressed. The Great Prussian Uprising in the 1260s in particular showed how deep the rejection of foreign rule was. It was only after decades that the resistance was finally broken. With military security, the actual construction of the state of the order began. The order specifically promoted the settlement of settlers from the Holy Roman Empire. Farmers received land, craftsmen and merchants privileges. New cities were founded, planned, structured, and equipped with city rights. The so-called Culm Law regulated administration, jurisdiction, and economic organization. It created a reliable basis for trade and urban life. The cities quickly developed into economic centers. Access to the Baltic Sea opened up trade opportunities with Scandinavia, the northern German Hanseatic cities, and even with Western Europe. Grain, wood, furs, and above all, amber were exported. In return, salt, cloth, and metal goods entered the country. The state of the order became part of the flourishing Baltic trade, which was later to be dominated by the Hanseatic League. While the cities grew, the state as a whole remained heavily militarized. Unlike in many European empires, there was no hereditary nobility that claimed a political say. The ruling class consisted of knights of the order who derived their authority from religious mandates. The country was divided into commanderies, administrative districts under the leadership of a commander. This structure combined spiritual discipline with military efficiency. The center of this power was ultimately Marienburg, a huge fortress on the Nogat, an estuary of the Vistula. It became the residence of the Grand Master and the symbol of the state of the order. With its extensive courtyards, chapels, and defensive fortifications, it embodied the order's claim to durability and size. This is where politics was made, where envoys were received, where war and peace were decided. But the state of the order was not only a military machine. He saw himself as a Christian force for order. Education, church organization, and administration were promoted. Monasteries were established, writing increased, and documents regulated ownership. The integration into the Latin Christian world brought new cultural impulses to the region. Latin was the administrative language. German dialects shaped the everyday life of many settlers. Nevertheless, the relationship with the local population remained complex. Many Prussians adopted the Christian faith and were absorbed into the new society. Others lost their ancestral rights or became dependent farmers. Over generations, cultures merged, but the original Baltic identity increasingly faded. While the religious state was consolidating, its geopolitical situation was also changing. Initially, he had justified his expansion with the missionary work of the pagans. But in the late 14th century, Lithuania was also Christianized, one of the last pagan grand duchies in Europe. This eliminated a central pretext for further crusades. A missionary war turned into a power political conflict between established Christian powers. In particular, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania grew into serious rivals. The tensions finally erupted in the Battle of Tannenberg in 1410. There the order suffered a devastating defeat against a united Polish-Lithuanian army. Although the state remained, its military invincibility was broken. From that moment on, the order was increasingly on the defensive. The following decades were marked by internal tensions. Cities and landed gentry that had developed strongly economically demanded more say. The rigid hierarchy of the order came under pressure. High war costs and reparation payments weakened the finances. Finally, in the 15th century, the 13 Years' War broke out between the Order and the Prussian League, an association of dissatisfied cities and nobles who subordinated themselves to the Polish king. The war ended in 1466 with the Second Peace of Tarunia. The western part of the Order's territory fell to Poland, while the eastern part remained as a Polish fief under the rule of the Order. The once expansive Crusader state had shrunk and been politically weakened. Despite these losses, the Order remained an important factor in the Baltic Sea region. Its administrative structures, its cities, and its economic networks persisted. But the time of religiously legitimized expansion was over. Europe had changed. The Reformation, humanism, and new power constellations heralded a new era. In the early 16th century, another profound change was to follow. Under the impression of the Reformation, the last Grand Master in Prussia secularized the state of the order and transformed it into a secular duchy. This marked the end of the era of the ecclesiastical knightly state, and the way was clear for a new phase in Prussia's history. But the foundations that had been laid in the 13th and 14th centuries continued to have an effect. The idea of a tightly organized state, the importance of military strength, the close connection between administration and discipline, all of this had a lasting impact on the political culture of the region. The state of the order had created a structure on which later rulers could build. Thus, the Teutonic Order was much more than an episode of medieval crusade history. He formed a territory, created institutions, and established a model of power that was to shape the region for centuries. A state had emerged from a mission project, and a borderland had become a political center in Eastern Europe. The history of Prussia had its second decisive beginning here, no longer as a pagan tribal area, but as an organized military-oriented state on the Baltic Sea, created by knights who had come to rule in the name of their faith, and who inadvertently laid the foundation for one of the most influential powers in Europe. Chapter 3: The Change to the Duchy of Prussia, 1525. At the beginning of the 16th century, only a shadow of its former self remained of the once powerful state of the Teutonic Order. The defeat by Poland-Lithuania, territorial losses, and economic exhaustion had shaken its foundations. The great times of the Crusades in the East were over. The religious justification for expansion had disappeared with the Christianization of Lithuania, and an intellectual revolution was announced within Europe that fundamentally questioned the foundation of ecclesiastical authority, the Reformation. When Martin Luther published his theses in 1517, a development began that not only changed religious life, but also shook political orders. For ecclesiastical rulers such as the order state, this new movement was particularly explosive, for it questioned the central role of the Catholic Church, and thus also the legitimacy of an order of knights that saw itself as a defender of this very church. At the head of the remaining territory of the order in Prussia was a young Grand Master, Albrecht of Brandenburg-Ansbach. He came from the House of Hohenzollern, a Franconian noble family with far-reaching connections in the Holy Roman Empire. Albrecht was ambitious, educated, and familiar with the political currents of his time. But he took on an office in a difficult situation. The order was financially weakened, politically isolated, and formally a fief of the Polish king, a dependence that many knights of the order found humiliating. Albrecht first tried to turn the situation around militarily. He refused to take the oath of feud to the Polish king and hoped for support from the empire. But the hoped-for support failed to materialize. A war against Poland between 1519 and 1521 did not bring about a decisive turning point, but deepened the crisis. The order was militarily and financially overwhelmed. In this hopeless situation, Albrecht turned to a new idea, an idea that was rooted not on the battlefield, but in the thinking of her time. He came into contact with Martin Luther, who made him a radical proposal. Why should a spiritual order of knights stick to an outdated structure when it could transform its territory into a secular principality? Why not give up the rule of the order, break the ecclesiastical ties, and run the country as a hereditary duchy? What at first seemed like a breach of taboo developed into a realpolitik option. The Reformation offered not only a religious alternative, but also a political opportunity. By accepting the Lutheran faith, Albrecht was able to sever his spiritual ties to Rome. By secularizing the religious state, he was able to make himself a secular duke. This historic step took place in 1525. Albrecht resigned from his office as Grand Master, officially converted to Lutheranism, and transformed the order's territory into the Duchy of Prussia. In Krakow, he swore feudal allegiance to the Polish king, but no longer as a knight of the order, but as a secular duke. This act created the first Protestant state in Europe. This change was more than a formal act. It marked the end of a model of spiritual rule that had lasted for more than 300 years and the beginning of a new political order. A religiously legitimized knightly state became a dynastically led principality. Authority was no longer based on papal recognition, but on secular rule and sovereign church power. Secularization brought about profound changes. Monasteries were dissolved or converted, church property was nationalized, and the administration was reorganized. Lutheran doctrine was introduced, church regulations were issued, sermons were held in German. Education was given a new significance because the Reformation placed emphasis on reading the Bible. Schools were promoted, and in 1544 Albrecht founded the University of Königsberg, later known as the Albertina. It was intended to train not only clergy, but also administrative officials and scholars. But the transition was not without conflict. Within the order, there was resistance to Albrecht's decision. Many knights felt betrayed, others refused to accept the new faith. The step also met with criticism in Catholic Europe. The Grand Master of a religious order had effectively given up his office and transferred the territory into personal possession, an unprecedented event. Politically, the Duchy of Prussia initially continued to be dependent on Poland. It remained a fief of the Polish crown. But in fact, Albrecht gained greater freedom of action than before. He was able to shape his politics independently, form alliances and implement reforms without having to submit to the internal rules of an order of knights. The country also changed socially. The nobility gained in importance, as it was no longer dominated by a religious order, but could take on political functions in a secular duchy. At the same time, the administration remained strongly structured, a legacy of the order's time that was to prove to be permanently formative. Religiously, the duchy became a center of Lutheranism in Eastern Europe. Theologians, preachers and printers worked from here to neighboring regions. The new denomination was supported by the state, but at the same time it remained part of the larger Protestant movement in the empire. Prussia thus became a link between the German-speaking world and Eastern Europe. Albrecht saw himself as an enlightened prince of his time. He promoted science, art, and administration. Nevertheless, his reign was not free of tensions. Economic problems, religious disputes, and political dependence on Poland remained challenges. In addition, the question of dynastic succession arose in the long term. With the conversion into a hereditary duchy, the country was now bound to the Hohenzollern family. This dynastic continuity was to prove decisive for later development. When Albrecht's line died out in the 17th century, the duchy fell to another line of the Hohenzollerns, the Electors of Brandenburg. This created a personal union that was to lay the foundation for the later Kingdom of Prussia. But in 1525, all this was still a dream of the future. Initially, secularization meant above all stabilization. The decades-long state of limbo between spiritual tradition and political reality was over. The country had a clear structure, a defined rule, and a new religious identity. The transformation into the Duchy of Prussia is an example of how closely religion and politics were intertwined in the 16th century. The Reformation was not only a religious movement, but also a catalyst for state reorganization. For Prussia, it meant turning away from the medieval model of the order and taking the step towards early modern princely statehood. At the same time, much has been preserved. The strong administration, the military tradition, and the awareness of a special role in Eastern Europe did not disappear. They were transferred into a new form. The Crusader order had become a principality, but the self-image of being a force for order in a border region remained. The year 1525 marks a turning point. It was the end of one epoch and the beginning of another. The walls of the order's castles were still standing, the cities remained, but their political significance had changed fundamentally. Prussia was no longer a spiritual missionary state, but a Protestant duchy, small, dependent, and yet full of potential. In this transformation lay the seed of everything that was to follow. For with the combination of dynastic continuity, reformed religion, and strict administration, a structure emerged that would continue to develop in the coming centuries. Prussia was not yet a kingdom, not a great power, not an engine of German unity. But it was an independent state, and the first of its kind to be openly and permanently founded on a Protestant basis. The history of Prussia had thus taken a new direction. It was no longer the sword of the knights of the order that determined his nature, but the political wisdom of a prince who had the courage to leave old structures. Secularization gave rise to a new identity, an identity that stood between tradition and renewal and that made the further rise of Prussia possible. Chapter 4: Brandenburg and Prussia, a dynastic connection. When the secular Duchy of Prussia emerged from the ecclesiastical state of the order in 1525, a decisive step had been taken, but the country initially remained politically limited. It was a fief of the Polish crown, geographically separated from the Holy Roman Empire and strategically vulnerable. Nevertheless, there was a potential in his new structure that would not fully unfold until decades later, through a dynastic union that at first seemed like an accidental succession, but was to prove to be a historical turning point. At the center of this development was the House of Hohenzollern. This noble family had its roots in Swabia, but had risen to become one of the most important dynasties in the empire in the 15th century. From 1415 onwards, the Hohenzollerns provided the electors of Brandenburg, that extensive but economically rather weak territory in the northeast of the empire. Brandenburg was politically important because, as elector, its ruler had the right to co-elect the Roman German king. But militarily and economically, it lagged behind other principalities for a long time. Thus, while a line of the Hohenzollerns ruled in Brandenburg, another line of the same family ruled in the Duchy of Prussia, that which had been founded by Albrecht of Brandenburg-Ansbach. Both territories were separated from each other, both geographically and politically. Between them lay Polish and Lithuanian territories, but they were connected by a common dynastic origin. In the 17th century, the power structure of Europe began to be reorganized. The 30 Years' War devastated large parts of the empire and led to a lasting weakening of many principalities. Brandenburg also suffered badly from the destruction. Entire regions were depopulated, cities ruined, the economy on the ground. During this phase, a young elector took over the reign in 1640, Friedrich Wilhelm, later known as the Great Elector. But even before he took office, a decisive dynastic development had taken place. In 1618, the Prussian line of the Hohenzollerns had become extinct in the male line. The last duke had left no male heirs. According to the inheritance treaties, the Duchy of Prussia fell to the Brandenburg line of the Hohenzollerns. This created a personal union. The Elector of Brandenburg was now also Duke of Prussia. This association was initially purely dynastic. Brandenburg remained part of the Holy Roman Empire, while Prussia continued to be a Polish fiefdom. The two areas were not next to each other, but separate. Nevertheless, this constellation fundamentally changed the strategic starting position. For the first time, a Brandenburg ruler had a territory outside the borders of the empire, a country that was not subject to the emperor, but formally to the Polish king. For Friedrich Wilhelm, this situation meant a challenge, but also an opportunity. He realized early on that the power of his house could not be based solely on title or tradition, but on military strength, financial stability, and diplomatic skill. The personal union offered him the opportunity to pool resources and create a new power base. A central problem, however, was Poland's feudal sovereignty over Prussia. As long as the Duke of Prussia was beholden to the Polish king, his sovereignty remained limited. Frederick William took advantage of the political tensions between Poland and Sweden to strengthen his position. In the Second Northern War, 1655 to 1660, he skillfully changed sides, negotiated with both powers, and finally achieved full sovereignty over Prussia in the Treaty of Wehlau in 1657. The Polish king renounced his feudal sovereignty. Prussia was now an independent duchy under the rule of the Hohenzollerns. This step was of enormous importance. For the first time, he created the basis for independent power politics outside the imperial constitution. While Brandenburg continued to be integrated into the complex structure of the empire, Prussia was able to act more independently as a sovereign territory. This dual position, imperial prince in the west, sovereign duke in the east, gave the House of Hohenzollern a special flexibility. Frederick William used this position to systematically strengthen his territories. He built up a standing army, reformed the administration, and promoted the economy. The experiences of the 30 Years' War had shown him that only a well-organized state could survive. In Brandenburg as well as in Prussia, he relied on centralization and efficiency. Tax collection, military organization, and civil service were modernized. The geographical separation of the areas played a double role. On the one hand, it made uniform administration more difficult. On the other hand, it forced the elector to create super-regional structures. The connection between Brandenburg and Prussia was not a matter of course. It had to be shaped politically. Roads, postal connections, and administrative networks were expanded. Gradually, a coherent state consciousness emerged that went beyond regional borders. The personal union was also remarkable in terms of denomination. Both areas were Protestant, but the religious situation within the empire was complex. Brandenburg was predominantly Lutheran, while the Elector himself was of the Reformed Calvinist faith. This denominational diversity forced the rulers to adopt a pragmatic policy of tolerance. Religious conflicts should not endanger the stability of the state. Over time, the personal union developed into more than just a dynastic union. Brandenburg Prussia, as the entity was now often called, increasingly appeared as a political actor. Although it was not yet a great power, it had a growing army, stable finances, and a strategic location between the Baltic Sea and Central Europe. Crucially, the Hohenzollerns began to think of their rule not only territorially, but structurally. It was not a matter of loosely governing individual countries, but of uniting them in a common power structure. The administration was standardized, military structures centralized. The Elector was no longer just the sovereign of individual provinces, but the head of a state that was forming. This development had long-term consequences. When Frederick William's son, Frederick III, later aspired to the title of king, he was able to invoke the sovereignty of Prussia. Since Prussia was outside the empire, it was possible to assume a royal title there without violating the hierarchy of the empire. In 1701 he crowned himself King of Prussia in Königsberg. Without the dynastic connection of 1618 and the sovereignty achieved, this step would have been unthinkable. But in the 17th century, all this was still in the making. Brandenburg and Prussia were two different worlds. On the one hand, the traditional electorate in the empire, on the other, the former order's territory on the Baltic Sea. The connection was fragile, but it was strengthened by clever politics. What began as an inheritance developed into a strategic alliance within a ruling house. The Hohenzollerns knew how to turn geographical fragmentation into a strength. By connecting their territories through administration, military, and dynasty, they created the basis for a state that would soon play a far greater role. Thus, the unification of Brandenburg and Prussia marked the beginning of a new power base. It was not a spectacular upheaval, not a sudden triumph, but a gradual process. But in this process lay the seed for later promotion. Two separate territories gave rise to a political entity that had to learn to deal with diversity, distance, and ambitions for power. The Hohenzollerns had understood that the future was not based solely on tradition, but on organization, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. Brandenburg Prussia was not yet a kingdom, not a great power, but it was more than the sum of its parts. The dynastic union was the prerequisite for everything that was to follow, for military reforms, for the claim to royal dignity, and for the later rise to one of the most formative powers in Europe. Here in the 17th century, the real history of political Prussia began, no longer as an isolated duchy or weakened electorate, but as a united dominion under a dynasty determined to turn its new position into a lasting power. Chapter 5: The Great Elector, Foundation of Power. When Frederick William took over the rule of Brandenburg and Prussia in 1640, his state was little more than a torn patchwork quilt. The 30 Years' War had devastated cities, depopulated villages, and economically ruined entire swathes of land. Brandenburg was one of the hardest-hit areas of the Holy Roman Empire. Armies had repeatedly passed through, plundered, burned, and extorted tributes. Trade and agriculture were on the ground. The state treasury was empty. What Frederick William took over was not an aspiring principality, but a political entity on the verge of insignificance. And yet it was precisely out of this crisis that the foundation stone for Prussia's later rise was to be laid. The young Elector had a decisive advantage. He had spent part of his youth in the Netherlands, one of the most economically modern and militarily efficient states of his time. There he learned the importance of discipline, administration, and trade. These impressions had a lasting impact on his political thinking. Friedrich Wilhelm was not a visionary idealist, but a sober power politician. He knew that his state could only survive if it fundamentally renewed itself. His first priority was safety. The experience of the 30 Years' War had shown that a prince without his own standing army was at the mercy of the whims of foreign powers. Mercenary troops that had been used in the war had often caused more damage than they had provided protection. Frederick William therefore began to build up a permanent army under central control. This step was revolutionary. A standing army required regular income, fixed structures, and strict discipline. It also meant a shift in the balance of power at home. In order to be able to finance the military in the long term, the Elector had to enforce new tax regulations. In doing so, he initially met with resistance from the estates, especially the nobility and the cities, which had previously had considerable rights to have a say. Friedrich Wilhelm took a pragmatic approach. He used the threat of external enemies as an argument for military reforms and negotiated compromises with the estates. In return for tax approvals, he secured the nobility influence in the countryside and privileged positions in the officer corps. This created a close connection between the military and the Junkers, which was to become formative for Prussia. Parallel to the build-up of the army, the Elector reformed the administration. The territorial fragmentation of Brandenburg Prussia, with possessions in the Rhineland, Westphalia, Prussia, and the Margraviate of Brandenburg, represented an enormous organizational challenge. In order to govern these areas effectively, Frederick William created central authorities that worked nationwide. Particularly important was the establishment of the Privy Council as the highest advisory and administrative body. Gradually, a tighter, centralized state structure emerged. Decisions were no longer made exclusively regionally, but were prepared and implemented by an increasingly professional bureaucracy. Civil servants were selected on the basis of competence, not just on the basis of origin. This development strengthened the authority of the Elector considerably. But the military and administration alone could not stabilize the state. Equally important was the economic recovery. The war had hit agriculture hard, many fields lay fallow, and there was a shortage of workers. Frederick William recognized that economic strength was the basis of political power. He relied on an active economic policy that was strongly influenced by the Dutch model. Today we speak of mercantilism. The state specifically promoted manufactories, protected domestic production through tariffs, and tried to increase exports. The aim was to bring as much money as possible into the country and reduce dependencies on imports. The promotion of immigration was particularly important. In 1685, Frederick William issued the Edict of Potsdam, which offered persecuted Huguenots from France refuge in Brandenburg, Prussia. Tens of thousands of Protestant refugees accepted the offer. They brought craftsmanship, trade contacts, and economic impulses with them. In Berlin, Potsdam, and other cities, they founded workshops, manufactories, and trading companies. This targeted settlement policy was not only motivated by humanitarian reasons, but also strategic. The Elector knew that his state needed people, workers, taxpayers, soldiers. Through religious tolerance, he won loyal subjects and at the same time strengthened the economy. Infrastructure has also been invested. Canals were built to connect rivers and facilitate trade. The expansion of shipping on the Elbe and Oder promoted the transport of goods. Berlin, previously rather insignificant, began to develop into an administrative center. Militarily, the new army already proved itself during Frederick William's lifetime. In the Northern War against Sweden, Brandenburg Prussia was able to make territorial gains and strengthen its position on the Baltic Sea. The Battle of Fehrbellin in 1675 in particular later became a symbol of the rise of Brandenburg's military power. Although it was not militarily decisive for the European balance of power, it showed that Brandenburg Prussia was able to act independently and assert itself against established powers. Another decisive step was the achievement of full sovereignty over the Duchy of Prussia. In the Treaty of Wehlau in 1657, Frederick William succeeded in getting the Polish king to renounce his feudal sovereignty. Prussia thus became an independent territory under the rule of the Hohenzollerns. This diplomatic success created the basis for later developments, especially for the possibility of accepting a royal title there. Domestically, Frederick William consolidated his position through a combination of authority and pragmatism. He strengthened the sovereign power without seeking open confrontation with the estates. His policy was not revolutionary, but gradual and purposeful. He knew how to create long-term structures instead of looking for short-term effects. When he died in 1688, he left behind a state that was hardly comparable to that of 1640. The army was powerful and disciplined, the administration centralized and efficient, the economy on the upswing. Brandenburg Prussia was not yet a great power, but it was on its way there. The decisive factor in Frederick William's work was not so much a single spectacular victory or a territorial expansion. It was the creation of stable foundations. He turned a devastated country into a state capable of acting. He combined military strength with economic promotion and administrative reform. Later, his grandson was to assume the title of king, and his great-grandson was to lead Europe into wars as Frederick the Great. But without the reforms and structures of the great Elector, this rise would hardly have been conceivable. Friedrich Wilhelm understood that power does not arise from tradition alone, but from organization, discipline, and resources. At a time when many princes still dreamed of dynastic splendor, he concentrated on sober state formation. He laid the foundation for what was later often referred to as the Prussian virtues, a sense of duty, efficiency, military strength, and state order. Thus, his reign marked the actual beginning of Brandenburg Prussia's political rise. From a fragmented, war-torn territory, he formed a consolidated state with a clear power structure. The foundation was laid, and on this foundation a kingdom was to rise in the coming decades that would have a lasting impact on European history. Chapter 6, 1701, The Birth of the Kingdom of Prussia. On January 18, 1701, a splendid court gathered in the castle church of Königsberg. Nobles in sumptuous robes, officers in festive uniforms, clergymen and envoys from various European countries attended an event that at first glance might seem like an act of courtly vanity, but in reality marked a profound political change. On this day, Frederick I of Prussia crowned himself king in Prussia. With this ceremony, the former Electorate of Brandenburg and the Duchy of Prussia became a kingdom, at least in one of its parts. It was the visible expression of a claim to power that had been prepared for decades. The path to the king's title. Frederick was the son of the great Elector, Frederick William. He had taken over a consolidated, militarily organized state from his father. But while Frederick William had focused primarily on internal consolidation and military strength, his son strove for dynastic splendor and European recognition. As Elector of Brandenburg, Frederick was one of the highest-ranking princes in the Holy Roman Empire, but the title remained formally below the royal dignity. In Baroque Europe, rank played a decisive role. Kingdoms stood above principalities, kings over electors. Diplomatic relations, marriage connections, and political perception were closely linked to titles. Frederick wanted to raise his House of Hohenzollern to the same level as the great dynasties of Europe. But in the Holy Roman Empire there was already a king, the Roman-German king, who was also emperor. Another king of Brandenburg would have been constitutionally impossible. The way out lay in the east, in the Duchy of Prussia. Prussia did not belong to the territory of the empire, but had been a sovereign territory outside the imperial hierarchy since the Treaty of Wailo in 1657. This was exactly where the legal possibility lay. When Frederick did not call himself King of Brandenburg but King of Prussia, he did not formally violate the imperial order. Diplomacy and calculation. However, the title was not only a question of legal sophistry. It had to be politically secured. Frederick needed the approval of the emperor, Leopold I. The opportunity presented itself in the context of the War of the Spanish Succession. The emperor needed allies against France and was dependent on military support. Frederick recognized his chance. He offered the emperor troop help in return for the recognition of his royal title. After tough negotiations, Leopold I finally agreed. In 1700, the corresponding agreement was reached. The way to the coronation was clear. The coronation in Königsberg. On January 18, 1701, Frederick put on the crown himself in Königsberg Castle. This self-coronation was deliberately staged. It symbolized independence and sovereignty. He then crowned his wife Sophie Charlotte as queen. The ceremony was a Baroque demonstration of power. Golden insignia, magnificent robes, and elaborate rituals underlined the claim to equality with the old monarchies of Europe. The new title was deliberately King in Prussia, not of Prussia. This is because parts of historic Prussia continued to belong to Poland. It was only later that the shortened form King of Prussia was to prevail. With this act, the Kingdom of Prussia was born. More than symbolism. Was this coronation only an expression of personal vanity? Contemporaries actually accused Frederick of excessive love of splendor. The court in Berlin and Königsberg was expanded, castles expanded, festivals organized. The king invested enormous sums in representation. But there was a strategic goal behind the staging. The title of king changed the perception of the state. Brandenburg Prussia now appeared as a kingdom, with greater diplomatic weight. Marriage relationships became more attractive, alliances more easily concluded. The new rank also strengthened the inner self-image. The various territories, Brandenburg, Prussia, Cleves, Mark, and others, were previously loosely connected. The king's title had an integrative effect. He created a common point of reference, a symbolic bracket across geographically separated areas. Europe in transition. Around 1700, Europe was in a phase of intense power shifts. France under Louis XIV dominated the continent. England and the Netherlands asserted themselves as maritime and trading powers, and Austria fought on several fronts. In this environment, the new Kingdom of Prussia was initially not a heavyweight. It had limited resources and was territorially fragmented. But it had something else, a growing army, a tight administration, and now also royal legitimacy. The title alone did not make a great power, but it created the prerequisite for long-term advancement. Frederick I himself was less of a military reformer than his father or son. He focused more on culture and science. The founding of the Academy of Sciences in Berlin and the promotion of art and architecture gave the young kingdom cultural prestige. Berlin began to develop into a residential city with European aspirations. The meaning of the wording. The unusual form of the title King in Prussia was an expression of political caution. It formally respected the borders of the empire and the claims of Poland. But it already contained a dynamic. In everyday language, the title was quickly shortened to King of Prussia. This linguistic shift reflected a development in content. The awareness of being a kingdom grew. The identity increasingly shifted from the Electorate of Brandenburg to Prussia as the namesake and symbol. Domestic political impact. For the subjects, the royal dignity meant an upgrade of their state. The nobility benefited from higher rank in international encounters. Officers now served a king, not just an elector. At the same time, structural challenges remained: fragmented territory, limited finances, military threats. The royal dignity was both an obligation and an entitlement. It set standards that had to be met. The foundation for generations to come. Frederick I died in 1713. His son, Frederick William I, was to give the kingdom a new direction. While his father had relied on glamour and representation, his son concentrated uncompromisingly on the military and thrift. Under him, Prussia became a highly disciplined military state. But without the coronation of 1701, this development would hardly have been conceivable. The royal title created the institutional framework in which Prussia could develop. It gave the state rank and self-confidence, two factors that were decisive in the European power structure. A new player on the European stage. With the birth of the Kingdom of Prussia, a new actor appeared on the European stage. He was not yet dominant, nor was he in the shadow of greater powers. But the combination of dynastic ambition, military organization, and now royal dignity was to prove effective. The coronation in Königsberg was therefore more than a magnificent event. It marked the transition from an aspiring principality to a recognized monarchy. It was the visible sign of a claim to power that was to develop further in the course of the 18th century. A former state of the order had become a duchy, the duchy a personal union, the personal union a consolidated territorial state. The next phase began in 1701. Prussia was now a kingdom, ready to take its place in European history. Chapter 7. The Soldier King. When Frederick William I ascended the throne in 1713, the Kingdom of Prussia was little more than a young state with great ambitions. His father had created splendor and rank with the coronation of 1701, but the magnificent court had placed a heavy burden on the state treasury. The new king was the exact opposite of his predecessor. Where Baroque splendor had previously prevailed, sober austerity now appeared. Where festivals and courtly culture dominated, thrift and discipline followed. Frederick William I marked the beginning of an era that was to leave a lasting mark on Prussia. His character showed itself early on. He despised excessive luxury, distrusted courtly vanity, and attached great importance to order. As soon as he took office, he drastically reduced court expenses. Expensive festivals were abolished, unnecessary offices were eliminated, and the administration was streamlined. The funds that were thus freed up did not flow into representation, but into what for him constituted the core of state existence, the army. For Frederick William I, the military was not only an instrument of foreign policy, but the foundation of the state itself. He was convinced that a small geographically fragmented state like Prussia could only survive through military strength. The experience of the preceding decades had shown how quickly larger powers could overrun smaller territories. Security meant independence, and independence required a powerful army. When he ascended the throne, Prussia already had a respectable army, but the soldier king systematically expanded it. By the time of his death, the army had grown to about 80,000 men, an enormous number for a state with a comparatively small population. Compared to other European countries, Prussia was thus disproportionately strong militarily. But size alone was not decisive. Frederick William I attached great importance to discipline, training, and organization. The officers were rigorously trained, drill perfected, and the hierarchy clearly defined. The soldier should not only be able to fight, but be part of a precisely functioning whole. Drill and order became trademarks. A central element of his military policy was the so-called canton system. It reorganized recruitment. The country was divided into districts, each of which was assigned to certain regiments. Farmers and citizens were registered and were basically available as recruits without being permanently torn from their civilian lives. This system combined military service with economic productivity and made the army predictable. At the same time, Frederick William I tied the nobility closely to the military. The Prussian landed gentry, the Junkers, were given preferential access to officer positions. This created a symbiosis. The nobility ensured loyalty and military leadership to the king, while the king guaranteed the nobility social preeminence. This connection between the nobility and the army was to shape Prussia's political culture in the long term. The soldier king also became famous, or notorious, for his tall guys, an elite unit of exceptionally tall soldiers, whom he particularly appreciated. He searched all over Europe for tall men, bought them free from other princes, or accepted them as diplomatic gifts. This regiment was less militarily necessary than an expression of his personal fascination, but even here his organizational zeal was evident. As much as the military was at the center, the administration was also important to him. Frederick William I knew that a large army could only be financed and organized by an efficient bureaucracy. That is why he fundamentally reformed the state apparatus. In 1723, he created the General Directorate, a central authority that bundled finance, military, and economic affairs. This institution was a milestone. It combined civil administration with military organization and created clear responsibilities. Civil servants were no longer appointed solely on the basis of origin, but were selected on the basis of merit and reliability. Control and accountability have been tightened. Corruption and waste should have no place. The king himself worked with tireless energy. He got up early, checked files personally, wrote marginal notes and documents, and intervened directly in administrative processes. His way of governing was authoritarian but purposeful. Decisions were not postponed, but implemented. Financially, this policy proved to be successful. While many European countries were suffering from debt, Frederick William I managed to build up considerable reserves. For him, thriftiness was not an end in itself, but a prerequisite for military action. A full state treasury meant independence from foreign loans and political concessions. He also relied on stabilization economically. Agriculture was promoted, swamps drained, new settlers recruited. Manufactories emerged, especially in the textile and weapons sectors. The aim was to produce as many goods as possible in their own country and to reduce import dependencies. For him, economic policy was part of the reason of state. However, his rule was not free of harshness. Frederick William I demanded discipline not only from the military, but also from his family. In particular, the relationship with his son, the later Frederick II of Prussia, was marked by conflicts. His father expected military rigor and obedience, while his son was interested in music, literature, and philosophy. When the young crown prince tried to flee, the king reacted with extreme harshness. The incident revealed the relentless consistency with which Frederick William I enforced his ideas of duty. Nevertheless, his policy was successful in the long term. When he died in 1740, he left behind a state that was militarily strong, financially stable, and administratively efficient. Prussia was not yet a dominant great power, but it had an army that attracted attention throughout Europe. The administration functioned reliably. The state was thoroughly organized. The soldier king had transformed Prussia into a military and civil servant state. The military shaped not only foreign policy, but also the country's self-image. Discipline, a sense of duty and efficiency became leitmotifs. The state was no longer a loose association of territories, but a centrally controlled entity with a clear hierarchy. Some contemporaries saw him as a pedantic autocrat, others as a brilliant organizer. One thing is certain, without his reforms, the later rise of Prussia would hardly have been possible. His son Frederick II was to use the military machine created to lead Prussia into the ranks of the European great powers. But the basis for this was the work of the soldier king. Thus, the reign of Frederick William I stands for a decisive period in the history of Prussia. It was characterized by strictness and thrift, by drill and bureaucracy, by military passion and administrative rationality. This combination was the state's particular strength. Prussia was no longer a mere kingdom, but an efficiently organized power apparatus. The soldier king had formed a system from his father's structures that combined stability and assertiveness. On this foundation, a new phase was to unfold in the 18th century, a phase in which Prussia would enter top European politics under Frederick II. But without the quiet, relentless development under Frederick William I, this step would not have been possible. He was not a brilliant general, not a philosophical monarch, but he was the architect of a state whose order and discipline were to have an effect far beyond his own time. Chapter 8: Frederick the Great, Splendour and War. When Frederick II of Prussia ascended the Prussian throne in May 1740, he inherited a state that was militarily strong, financially sound, and administratively efficient. His father had left him a disciplined army and a well-stocked treasury, but also a strict upbringing and a strained father-son relationship. Frederick II, later called the Great, united opposites like hardly any other monarch of his time. He was a general and philosopher, flute player and warlord, promoter of the Enlightenment and architect of military expansion. Frederick was enthusiastic about literature, music, and French philosophy at an early age. He corresponded with Voltaire, wrote essays in French himself, and saw himself as the first servant of the state, a model of enlightened absolutism. Unlike many rulers, he saw his role not only as a dynastic privilege, but also as a responsibility towards the community. But no sooner had he taken over the crown than he presented Europe with a surprising reality. Prussia would not only shine through culture, but also grow through war. The grab for Silesia. In the same year of his accession to the throne, Emperor Charles VI died, and his daughter Maria Theresa took over the inheritance of the Habsburg monarchy. Although European powers had previously recognized her succession to the throne, her position was immediately questioned. Frederick recognized the opportunity. Silesia, an economically important and strategically important province, belonged to Austria. It was rich in mineral resources, industrially developed, and geographically close to the Prussian heartland. Frederick raised old inheritance claims and marched in. This step marked the beginning of the Silesian Wars, which were part of the larger War of the Austrian Succession. Prussia's army, formed under Frederick William I, proved to be powerful. The Battle of Mollwitz in 1741 and later at Hohenfriedberg showed that Prussia could fight militarily on an equal footing with established great powers. In the end, Austria had to cede most of Silesia to Prussia in the Treaty of Breslau in 1742. A second war a few years later confirmed this possession. With the annexation of Silesia, Prussia's territory had expanded considerably. Even more important, however, was the symbolic effect. Prussia was no longer an aspiring state, but a serious power factor in Europe. Between philosophy and generalism, Frederick knew how to combine military success with intellectual aspirations. While he was leading campaigns, he had Sanssouci Palace built in Potsdam, a retreat that became a symbol of his cultural aspirations. There he gathered scholars, musicians, and philosophers. His court was comparatively simple, but intellectually ambitious. As a representative of enlightened absolutism, Frederick carried out numerous reforms. The judiciary has been modernized, torture has been largely abolished, and religious tolerance has been promoted. Catholics, Protestants, and Jews could live comparatively freely in his state as long as they were loyal subjects. His famous dictum was that everyone should be blessed according to his own style. He also relied economically on promotion and rationalization. Agriculture was modernized, swamps drained, new cultivation methods introduced. The potato cultivation he propagated was supposed to alleviate famines. Administration and taxation have been further professionalized. But the European stage remained restless. The 7 Years' War, struggle for survival. In 1756, a new conflict broke out, the 7 Years' War. Europe's alliance systems had shifted. Prussia faced a coalition of Austria, France, Russia, and other powers. The situation was existentially threatening. Frederick decided on a preemptive strike and marched into Saxony. What followed was a years-long struggle on several fronts. Prussia's army was outnumbered, but tactically flexible. Battles such as those at Rossbach and Leuthen in 1757 went down in military history. Friedrich's quick maneuvers and concentrated attacks surprised his opponents. Nevertheless, Prussia came to the brink of collapse several times. Berlin was temporarily occupied, resources were exhausted, losses enormous. It was not until the death of the Russian Tsarina Elizabeth in 1762 that a turning point occurred. Her successor withdrew Russia from the war, an event that Friedrich later described as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. In the Treaty of Hubertusburg in 1763, the status quo was maintained. Prussia retained Silesia. But the price was high. The state was emaciated, the population decimated, the economy weakened. Nevertheless, Prussia had asserted itself against a superior force of European great powers. From then on, it was officially considered Europe's fifth great power alongside France, Great Britain, Austria, and Russia. Post-war reforms. After 1763, Frederick concentrated on reconstruction and reform. He reorganized the administration, strengthened the judiciary, and promoted education. The General Land Law, which was codified under his successors, had its roots in this phase of rationalization. His style of government remained autocratic, but characterized by rational sobriety. He worked tirelessly, personally examining files and interfering in details. For him, the state was an instrument that had to function efficiently. In terms of foreign policy, Prussia took part in the First Partition of Poland in 1772. In the process, It won West Prussia and created a territorial connection between Brandenburg and East Prussia. This step was calculated in terms of power politics, but morally controversial, and shows the ambivalence of Friedrich's politics. Myth and reality. Even during his lifetime, Frederick became a legend. His military successes, his intellectual interests, and his personal discipline fascinated contemporaries. He saw himself as an enlightened monarch, but his state remained heavily militarized. The army continued to be the backbone of Prussia. Administration and society are oriented towards discipline and a sense of duty. At the same time, a cultural splendor emerged that changed the image of Prussia abroad. When Frederick died in 1786, he left behind a significantly enlarged and politically consolidated kingdom. The population had grown, the economy had recovered, and the international reputation had risen considerably. Prussia as a great power. With Frederick the Great, Prussia had finally risen to the circle of European great powers. This status was based on three pillars: military strength, administrative efficiency, and enlightened reform policies. But this rise had its price. The wars had claimed enormous victims, burdened state finances, and brought the country to the brink of collapse several times. Prussia's identity remained closely linked to the military and discipline. Frederick too embodied this ambivalence like no other. He was a thinker and a fighter, a reformer and a conqueror. His legacy was contradictory, but undeniably formative. His death marked the end of an era that had led Prussia from an ambitious kingdom to a recognized great power. The state was stronger, bigger, and more self-confident than ever before. But the decades that followed were to show that military glory alone did not guarantee lasting security. Frederick's splendor was real, but Europe's challenges remained. Prussia had found its place among the powers. Now it had to learn to maintain it permanently. Chapter 9. Between Reform and Defeat. When Frederick II of Prussia died in 1786, he left behind a kingdom that was militarily respected and territorially grown. Prussia had become a great power, but much of what had made this rise possible had been closely linked to his personality. His successors had neither his military brilliance nor his political determination. While Europe was undergoing profound change, Prussia remained stuck in structures that seemed increasingly outdated. The French Revolution of 1789 shook monarchical Europe. Old orders began to falter, new ideas of freedom, nation, and civil rights spread. Prussia initially reacted with military intervention against revolutionary France, but soon withdrew from the coalition wars. They believed that they could keep their distance, a fatal misjudgment. With the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the power structure in Europe changed radically. Napoleon was not only a military genius, but also a political modernizer. His armies were flexible, mobile, and carried by national enthusiasm. In comparison, the Prussian military machine, which had once impressed Europe under Frederick the Great, seemed increasingly rigid. The catastrophe of 1806. Prussia tried for a long time to maneuver between France and its opponents. But in 1806, King Frederick William III decided to go to war against Napoleon. The decision was made late. The preparation was insufficient, the lead inconsistent. On October 14, 1806, there was a double battle at Jena and Auerstedt. Within a day, the Prussian army was devastatingly defeated. Napoleon's troops marched into Berlin almost unhindered. Fortresses capitulated, regiments disbanded, officers were taken prisoner. The defeat was not only militarily but psychologically devastating. The state, which had defined itself by discipline and military strength, had collapsed within a few weeks. The seemingly unshakable order had proven to be sluggish and outdated. In the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Prussia had to accept massive territorial losses. Almost half of its territory was lost, high contributions were imposed, and the army was drastically reduced. Prussia had sunk to a power of the second order, the hour of the reformers. But it was precisely in this crisis that a phase of profound renewal began. The defeat had the effect of a shock that broke up encrusted structures. A group of reformers realized that Prussia could only survive if it fundamentally modernized itself. Among the central figures of this renewal were Heinrich Friedrich Karl von Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg. Both were convinced that the state could not be saved by military discipline alone, but by structural reforms. Stein began a comprehensive administrative reform. The previous centralist control was relaxed, and self-government was introduced in cities. The City Edict of 1808 granted municipal autonomy and strengthened the bourgeoisie. Citizens could now participate in local decisions, an important step towards modern citizenship. At the same time, serfdom was abolished. Farmers were given personal freedom and could acquire property. These agrarian reforms profoundly changed the social structure. Although the implementation was not always fair, the principle of personal freedom was established. Hardenberg continued the reforms. He opened up state offices to non-nobles, making talent more important than origin. The education system was reorganized, universities reformed. In particular, the founding of the University of Berlin in 1810, shaped by Wilhelm von Humboldt, symbolized the demand for intellectual renewal. Military reorganization. The military was also fundamentally reformed. Under the leadership of reformers such as Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August Neidhart von Gneisenau, a new army organization emerged. The rigid recruitment system was replaced, officer careers were opened up to bourgeois talents, and training was modernized. A central element was the introduction of universal conscription. The soldier was no longer to be just a subject, but a citizen in uniform. This was associated with a new understanding of state and nation. War was no longer to be a dynastic struggle, but a defense of the fatherland. These reforms were not free of resistance. Conservative forces feared the loss of traditional privileges. Napoleon also distrusted any strengthening of Prussia and tried to obstruct reforms. Stein himself had to go into exile for a time, but the reform process could not be stopped. The path to liberation. When Napoleon began his Russian campaign in 1812, the political situation changed again. The Grande Army suffered a devastating defeat. Prussia, initially forced to support Napoleon, took the opportunity to change sides. In 1813, the country rose in the so-called War of Liberation. Volunteers volunteered. Patriotic enthusiasm gripped broad sections of the population. The Appeal to My People by Frederick William III appealed to national solidarity. In the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, Napoleon was decisively defeated. Prussia played a central role in the coalition. 2 years later, Napoleon's rule finally ended. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Prussia regained lost territories and received new territories in the Rhineland and Westphalia. The state was territorially stronger than before 1806, but it had also become a different one. Between tradition and modernity, the reform period had profoundly changed Prussia. Serfdom was abolished, administration modernized, military reorganized. The bourgeoisie had gained influence, education had been promoted. Nevertheless, Prussia remained a monarchy. A comprehensive constitution with parliamentary participation was not introduced. Many reform ideas remained limited or were later restricted again. Prussia now stood between tradition and modernity. The military catastrophe of 1806 had revealed the weaknesses of the old system. The reforms had made the state more efficient and modern, but they had also raised new expectations for political participation, for national unity. A turning point in history. The years between 1806 and 1815 were a turning point. Out of the deepest defeat grew renewal. The shock of Jena and Auerstedt destroyed the myth of invincible discipline, but it opened up the space for reform. Prussia had learned that military strength alone was not enough. A modern state needed educated citizens, efficient administration, and social mobility. The reforms of Stein and Hardenberg laid the foundation for further development in the 19th century. When Prussia emerged from the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, it was territorially powerful and structurally renewed. At the same time, however, a new awareness had formed, the striving for national unity and political participation. The catastrophe of 1806 had been a humiliation, but also the starting point for a transformation that made Prussia stronger in the long term. Between reform and defeat, the state had reinvented itself. Chapter 10: Prussia as the engine of German unity. After the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia had emerged stronger from the reorganization of Europe. It had received new territories on the Rhine in the west, modernized its administration, and reformed its military. But the German question, i.e., the political future of the many German states, remained unresolved. The German Confederation, created in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, was a loose association of sovereign principalities under the leadership of Austria. Prussia was a great power, but it was overshadowed by the Habsburg monarchy. In the course of the 19th century, however, Prussia's economic and political influence grew steadily. A decisive step was the founding of the German Customs Union in 1834, which, under Prussian leadership, abolished trade barriers between numerous German states. Economically, this created a uniform market, but politically Germany remained fragmented. The Revolution of 1848 was the first to openly express the desire for national unity and a liberal constitution. A national assembly met in Frankfurt to draft a German constitution. The crown of a united Germany was finally offered to the Prussian King Frederick William IV. But he refused. He did not want a crown from the hands of the people. The revolution failed, and national unity remained unfulfilled. Nevertheless, something had changed. The idea of a united Germany had not disappeared, and Prussia was increasingly the state that was strongest economically and militarily. The rise of Bismarck. When Otto von Bismarck was appointed Prime Minister of Prussia in 1862, a new phase began. Bismarck was conservative, loyal to the monarchy, and convinced that German unity would not be decided by parliamentary debates, but by power politics. His famous speech about blood and iron summed up his position. The big questions of the time would not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by military strength. Bismarck was not a national romantic. His goal was not a liberal nation-state, but a united Germany under Prussian leadership, without Austria. He recognized that Prussia could only take on the leading role in the German area if it decided the rivalry with Vienna. The war against Denmark in 1864. The first step was the conflict over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. When Denmark tried to bind Schleswig more closely to itself, Prussia and Austria intervened together. In the War of 1864, Denmark was defeated, and the duchies fell under joint administration. But Bismarck already had his eye on the next step. The joint administration was to create tensions between Prussia and Austria. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866. These tensions led to open conflict in 1866. In the so-called Austro-Prussian War, Prussia and Austria faced each other. The decisive factor was the Battle of Königgrätz, Zadova, in which the Prussian army under Helmuth von Moltke, equipped with modern equipment, achieved a clear victory. The war lasted only a few weeks, but its consequences were enormous. Austria left German politics. The German Confederation was dissolved, and in 1867 it was replaced by the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Prussia annexed several northern German states and increased its territory considerably. Thus, the small German solution, a Germany without Austria, was practically predetermined. The road to the empire. The last step towards unity led through France. Napoleon III viewed the growing Prussia with suspicion. Bismarck skillfully exploited the diplomatic crisis over the succession to the Spanish throne in 1870. With the so-called EMS dispatch, he provoked France so that it declared war on Prussia. The Franco-German War of 1870-71 unleashed a wave of national enthusiasm. Southern German states such as Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden joined Prussia. Together they defeated France. In the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III was taken prisoner. On January 18, 1871, Exactly 170 years after the Prussian coronation, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. The Prussian King Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor. Prussia was no longer just a kingdom, but the core and dominant power of a united German nation-state. Prussia's role in the new Reich. In the new empire, Prussia retained a preeminent position. The Prussian king was automatically German emperor. The Prussian prime minister was also Reich Chancellor, an office that Bismarck continued to hold. Prussia provided the largest part of the empire's territory, the population, and the army. The empire was organized federally, but the balance of power was clear. Prussia's military tradition, its administrative efficiency, and its political culture had a decisive influence on the new Germany. After 1871, Bismarck pursued a policy of consolidation. He wanted to stabilize the Reich and secure it in foreign policy. Through a skillful policy of alliances, he isolated France and sought to preserve peace in Europe. Domestically, however, he also led tough disputes. In the Kulturkampf, he came into conflict with the Catholic Church. Later, he fought the Social Democrats with anti-socialist laws. At the same time, he introduced social reforms, health, accident, and old age insurance, to bind workers to the state. Unity through power politics. German unity had not come about through a democratic revolution, but through 3 wars under Prussian leadership. Bismarck had skillfully combined national enthusiasm with dynastic politics. Prussia had not only made unification possible, but dominated it. This was a historic goal that many liberals had been calling for decades. But the manner in which the agreement was reached, from above, through military successes, shaped the character of the new state. The German Empire was constitutional, but not parliamentary in the modern sense. The emperor had great power. The military remained strongly influenced by the Prussian heritage. A new power structure. With the founding of the German Empire, the European balance was changed. Germany was now an economically and militarily strong power in the center of the continent. France was beaten and humiliated, Austria limited to Central Europe. Prussia had achieved its goal, it led Germany. But at the same time, it had partly brought its own identity into the empire. Military discipline, administrative efficiency, and monarchical authority became central elements of the new nation-state. The engine of the unit. Prussia had been the engine of German unity, through economic integration in the Zollverein, through military reforms, through diplomatic skill, and ultimately, through Bismarck's strategic planning. Over the centuries, the former state of the order on the Baltic Sea had grown into a power that now united an entire country. The coronation of 1701 had made Prussia a kingdom, the reforms after 1806 had modernized it, and the wars of unification had elevated it to the leading force of a nation-state. 1871 marked the beginning of a new era. Prussia had not disappeared, it had been absorbed into the German Reich and at the same time remained its dominant force. But the power created by blood and iron also carried tensions. National pride, military self-confidence, and economic advancement shaped the following decades. Prussia had united Germany, and thus permanently changed the political map of Europe. Chapter 11. Prussia in the Empire. With the founding of the German Empire in 1871, Prussia had not disappeared, it had changed its role. An independent kingdom had become the dominant constituent state of a new nation-state. The German Empire was federally organized, but Prussia accounted for about 2/3 of the Reich's territory and population. The Prussian king was also German emperor, and the Prussian prime minister usually remained Reich Chancellor in personal union. Thus, the political architecture of the empire was inseparably linked to Prussia. In the decades that followed, the empire, and with it Prussia, underwent profound change. Industrialization, urbanization, and technical progress are changing the economy and society at a rapid pace. At the same time, political tensions, social antagonisms, and foreign policy ambitions grew. Prussia was at the center of these developments, as a bearer of military tradition, as an engine of economic dynamism, and as the core of a state that was seeking its place in the world. Economic advancement. The decades after 1871 were characterized by impressive economic growth. Coal and steel production expanded, railway networks were expanded, and new industries emerged. Regions such as the Ruhr area and Upper Silesia developed into industrial centers of Europe. Prussia played a key role in this. Its rich raw material deposits, especially coal and iron, provided the basis for heavy industry and mechanical engineering. Companies such as Krupp or Siemens grew into global players. The population flocked to the cities, new residential districts were created, factory chimneys shaped the cityscape. The economic rise was accompanied by social change. A new working class was formed, while the bourgeoisie gained influence. Education became more important. Technical colleges and universities expanded their offerings. Berlin developed into a vibrant metropolis, a political center, industrial location, and cultural hotspot at the same time. Military imprint. Despite all the economic dynamism, the military tradition remained a formative element of the Prussian self-image. The army continued to be strongly influenced by Prussian officers, and the general staff system was considered a model for other states. Discipline, hierarchy, and a sense of duty were not only military virtues, but also permeated administration and education. Under Kaiser Wilhelm I, foreign policy initially remained cautious and determined by Bismarck's alliance system. After his dismissal in 1890 under Wilhelm II, the course changed. The new emperor pursued a more ambitious world policy. Naval building programs were to make Germany a maritime power, and colonial policy was to secure its place in the sun. This policy increased international tensions, especially with Great Britain. At the same time, the prestige of the military continued to grow internally. Parades, uniforms, and military symbols were an integral part of public staging. Critics spoke of militarism, an overemphasis on military values in public life. Political tensions. While the empire grew economically stronger, political conflicts remained unresolved. The political system was constitutional, but the emperor and the government had great influence. The Reichstag was elected, but its power was limited. In Prussia itself, the three-class electoral system continued to apply, which ensured disproportionate influence for wealthy citizens. Despite state repression, social democracy gained increasing support. Workers demanded better working conditions, political participation, and social security. Bismarck's social legislation had introduced new security systems, but social tensions remained. Confessional antagonisms also had an effect. The Kulturkampf had strained the relationship between the state and the Catholic Church. Although the conflict had been diffused in the 1880s, political polarization remained a feature of imperial policy. Urbanization and society. With industrialization, everyday life changed fundamentally. Millions of people moved from the countryside to the cities. Within a few decades, Berlin grew into a metropolis of millions. Electricity, trams, and modern infrastructure changed the cityscape, but the progress had its downsides. Housing shortages, poor hygienic conditions, and long working hours shaped the everyday life of many working-class families. Trade unions were formed, strikes became more frequent. The social question became a central issue in politics. At the same time, a lively cultural scene developed. Theater, literature, and science flourished. Technical innovations have made Germany a leading industrial country. Prussia's education system, already strengthened in earlier centuries, contributed significantly to this rise. Federal tension. Although the empire was a federal state, the balance of power remained unbalanced. Prussia dominated by its size and population. Smaller states such as Bavaria or Württemberg retained certain special rights, but politically there was no way around Berlin. This dominance led to tensions. Some contemporaries spoke of Prussian Germany instead of German Reich. The Prussian administrative culture, the military organization, and the political structure shaped the state as a whole more strongly than regional traditions. Foreign policy challenges. With the end of Bismarck's alliance policy, foreign policy uncertainty grew. Germany's naval construction and colonial ambitions led to rivalries with Great Britain and France. Alliance systems hardened, mistrust increased. Prussia, now the core of the Reich, was no longer just a continental power, but part of a global competition. Economic success and military ambition strengthened national self-assurance, but also international tensions. Between progress and conflict. The decades before 1914 were marked by a tension between impressive progress and increasing political polarization. Economically, Germany was one of the leading nations in the world. Science, technology, and industry reached new heights. But politically, the system remained contradictory. Democratic elements existed, but monarchical and military structures dominated. The Prussian heritage, discipline, hierarchy, and state authority remained central. When the First World War broke out in 1914, it became clear how strongly militarism and national pride were anchored. Enthusiastic crowds welcomed the outbreak of war. The Reich mobilized its enormous resources, economically and militarily. Conclusion of an era. Prussia in the German Empire was a country of change. Industrialization transformed the economy and society, political tensions demanded new answers, and military tradition remained formative. The state had developed from a regional kingdom to the core of a European great power. But the forces that had made this rise possible, military strength, economic dynamism, and centralized power, also carried risks. The political balance between monarchy and parliament remained fragile, social antagonisms grew, and international rivalries intensified. Thus, on the eve of the 20th century, Prussia stood as the dominant force in the German Reich, economically successful, militarily powerful, but politically riddled with tensions. The following years were to show whether this construction was permanently viable. With the outbreak of the First World War, a new chapter began, one that would shake not only the empire, but also the Prussian monarchy itself. Chapter 12. The First World War and the End of the Monarchy. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, the German Reich, and with it Prussia, was at the center of a conflict that would soon engulf all of Europe. 4 decades, political tensions, alliance systems, and military rearmament had reinforced each other. Now this dynamic was unleashed in a war that was originally planned as a short decisive battle, but developed into a years-long industrially fought battle of materials. For Prussia, the war initially meant a continuation of its military tradition. The army was strong, the general staff highly respected, and mobilization was efficient. Under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the empire went to war. Prussian officers and structures continued to shape military action. The army was seen as an expression of national strength, and as a guarantee for a quick victory. The road to war. The July crisis of 1914 had come to a head within a few weeks. After the assassination attempt in Sarajevo, the great powers declared war on each other. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, France and Russia lined up on the opposite side, and soon Great Britain too. The European powers were linked by a dense system of alliances that turned local conflicts into global war. In Berlin, there was initially confidence. The so-called Schlieffen Plan envisaged a quick victory over France before turning to Russia. But the offensive failed on the Marne. The war froze on the Western Front in a network of trenches, barbed wire, and artillery positions. The war as an industrial catastrophe. What followed was a war of new proportions. Millions of soldiers faced each other. Machine guns and heavy artillery claimed unimaginable numbers of victims. The war became a battle of materials. Factories mass-produced ammunition, railways transported troops, and the entire economy was converted to war production. Prussia's industrial centers, especially in the Ruhr area and Upper Silesia, played a central role. Steel, coal, and arms deliveries kept the fronts running. But the longer the war lasted, the greater the burden on the population. The British naval blockade cut Germany off from world trade. Food became scarce. The supply situation deteriorated dramatically. The so-called turnip winter of 1916-17 symbolizes hunger and hardship at home. While fighting was going on at the front, the civilian population suffered from scarcity and deprivation. Militarization of politics. As the war progressed, the balance of power within the country shifted. The military leadership increasingly gained influence on political decisions. Generals such as Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff de facto determined the war strategy and exerted considerable pressure on the government and the Kaiser. Prussia, as the core of the Reich, was closely linked to this military leadership. The boundaries between civilian and military authority became blurred. The image of the military state that had accompanied Prussia since the 18th century reached its climax here, and at the same time its overstretching. 1917, turning point in the war. In 1917, the United States entered the war. At the same time, Russia left the conflict as a result of the revolution. Although Germany was able to make territorial gains in the east, the American troops decisively strengthened the Western Front. In the spring of 1918, the German leadership launched a last major offensive. Initially, the troops made territorial gains, but they were exhausted and the resources were used up. In the summer, the Allies began a counteroffensive, which pushed back the German front step by step. The collapse of 1918. In the autumn of 1918, it was clear that the war was lost. The military leadership pushed for a ceasefire. At the same time, dissatisfaction among the population grew. Strikes, hunger protests, and political demands for reforms increased. When the naval leadership planned a final attack at the end of October 1918, a mutiny broke out in Kiel. The unrest spread rapidly. Workers' and soldiers' councils were formed, and the monarchy began to falter. The revolution of 1918 had begun. On November 9, 1918, the Republic was proclaimed in Berlin. On the same day, Reich Chancellor Max von Baden declared the abdication of the emperor, without his consent. Wilhelm II fled into exile in the Netherlands. With this step, not only the German imperial dignity ended, but also the Prussian royal rule. Since 1871, both offices had been combined in personal union. The abdication meant the end of the Kingdom of Prussia, the disappearance of the kingdom. The monarchy, which had begun in 1701 with the coronation in Königsberg, ended after 217 years. The Kingdom of Prussia became the Free State of Prussia, a republican member of the new German Reich, now called the Weimar Republic. The change was profound. The state, which for centuries had strongly identified with the military and monarchy, had to redefine itself. The three-class electoral system was abolished, and a democratic constitution was introduced. Prussia remained territorial, but its political identity had changed fundamentally. The Treaty of Versailles. The war officially ended with the armistice of November 11, 1918, but the peace conditions were to further destabilize the political situation. In the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, Germany had to cede territories, accept high reparations payments, and accept military restrictions. For Prussia, this meant considerable territorial losses. West Prussia and Poznan largely went to the newly founded Polish state. East Prussia was separated from the rest of the empire. Prussia also lost territories in the west. These losses hit not only economically, but also symbolically. The state, which had once grown through expansion, shrank. National humiliation and economic burdens shaped the mood of the post-war period. Between tradition and new beginnings. The fall of the monarchy was a shock for many contemporaries. The centuries-old connection between the crown, the military, and the state had been broken. At the same time, the possibility of a democratic reorganization opened up. Prussia played a stabilizing role in the early Weimar Republic. As the largest federal state, it had political weight. The new Republican leadership tried to reform the administration and police and consolidate democratic structures. But the memory of the monarchy, of military greatness and national unity remained alive. Many conservative circles perceived the Republic as a foreign body. These tensions were to shape the coming years. An epochal break. The First World War had not only claimed millions of lives, but also destroyed a political order that had grown for centuries. For Prussia, 1918 meant the end of its royal identity. From the state of the order to the duchy and the kingdom to the dominant member state in the empire, this development was now complete. The monarchy was history, the republic reality. But the history of Prussia did not end there. It entered a new phase, without a king, without an emperor, but still as a formative element of the German state. The First World War had shown that military power alone could not guarantee lasting stability. The emperor's abdication marked a deep turning point, and the beginning of an uncertain future in which Prussia had to reinvent itself. Chapter 13: The Free State of Prussia in the Weimar Republic. When the monarchy collapsed in November 1918 and Wilhelm II abdicated, not only the German Empire, but also the Kingdom of Prussia ended. But Prussia did not disappear from the political map. It changed. The monarchical state became the Free State of Prussia, a republican federal state within the newly founded Weimar Republic. This change was profound. For more than 2 centuries, Prussia had been closely associated with the crown, the military and monarchical authority. Now the same state was to become the bearer of democratic principles. What initially seemed like a contradiction developed into a remarkable political experiment in the 1920s. A new beginning in difficult times. The starting position was very difficult. The First World War had drained the country economically, and the Treaty of Versailles brought territorial losses, reparations demands, and political humiliation. Millions of soldiers returned to an uncertain future. Unemployment and inflation shook confidence in the new state. Prussia, as the largest German state, was particularly affected. It continued to cover large parts of the Reich's territory, from East Prussia and Brandenburg to the Rhineland and the Ruhr area. At the same time, it was strongly fragmented regionally. Catholic regions in the West differed culturally and politically significantly from the predominantly Protestant areas in the East. In 1920, Prussia received a new democratic constitution. The state was organized in parliament, a state parliament was elected, a government was formed. At the top was no longer a king, but a prime minister. Democratic stability under Braun. A central figure in this phase was Otto Braun. The Social Democrat became prime minister for the first time in 1920 and was to hold office, with interruptions, until 1932. Under his leadership, Prussia developed into a comparatively stable pillar of the Weimar Republic. While frequent changes of government and political crises dominated at the imperial level, Prussia succeeded in forming a relatively stable coalition of Social Democrats, center, and liberals. This so-called Weimar coalition focused on democratic reforms, administrative modernization, and social stabilization. The reform of the police was particularly important. After the revolutionary unrest of 1918-19, it had become clear how fragile public order was. The Prussian government built up a republican-minded police force that explicitly professed democracy. This was to prevent extremist forces from infiltrating the security organs. Prussia as a bulwark of democracy. In the 1920s, the Free State of Prussia was considered by many observers to be a bulwark of democracy. While radical parties gained influence from both the left and the right, the Prussian government tried to maintain political moderation. This was not an easy task. Communist uprisings, right-wing coup attempts, and paramilitary associations destabilized the young republic. In 1920, the Kapp Putsch had already shown how vulnerable the political system was. In Prussia, too, there were tensions between conservative elites and the Republican leadership. Nevertheless, the Prussian administration remained comparatively functional. This was not least due to the long tradition of efficient bureaucracy, which had already been built up in the 18th and 19th centuries. Ironically, part of the old Prussian heritage had a stabilizing effect here. Discipline and administrative professionalism now supported the Republic. Economic turbulence. The Weimar years were characterized by extreme economic fluctuations. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed savings and shook confidence in the state and currency. In Prussia, too, broad sections of the population suffered from the consequences. It was not until the currency reform and the introduction of the Rentenmark that the situation temporarily stabilized. In the so-called Golden Twenties, Prussian cities such as Berlin also experienced a cultural and economic boom. Theater, film and science flourished. Berlin became a center of modern art and political debate. But the stability was fragile. When the world economic crisis broke out in 1929, industrialized Prussia was hit particularly hard. Unemployment rose rapidly, social tensions increased. Millions of people lost their jobs, especially in the Ruhr area and other industrial regions. Political polarization. With the economic crisis, many voters became radicalized. Extremist parties gained popularity. The NSDAP under Adolf Hitler in particular was able to expand its influence. In Prussia, too, their election results rose significantly. The democratic government came under increasing pressure. Although Prussia formally remained a parliamentary democracy, the majorities in the state parliament became more unstable. Conservative forces called for an authoritarian turn. The decisive turning point took place in 1932. After violent clashes between political camps, Reich Chancellor Franz von Papen used an emergency decree to depose the elected Prussian government. This so-called Prussian coup effectively deposed Otto Braun and transferred power to a Reich commissioner. As a result, Prussia lost its democratic independence, even before the National Socialists took power in 1933. The Prussian coup was a decisive step towards authoritarian centralization. Between tradition and transformation. The years of the Free State show an ambivalent picture. On the one hand, Prussia succeeded in breaking away from the monarchical tradition and establishing democratic structures. Administration, police and government worked stably for long stretches. On the other hand, the state remained deeply involved in social conflicts. The old Prussian self-image, shaped by the military, hierarchy and a sense of duty, was in tension with a new democratic reality. Some continued to see Prussia as a conservative bastion, others experienced it as a reform-oriented modernizer. The end of self-reliance. With the Prussian coup in 1932, the end of the Free State as an independent political force began. When Hitler became Reich Chancellor in 1933, Prussia was already weakened. The National Socialists used the centralized structures to further expand their power. Prussia's federal independence was gradually undermined. The once dominant member state of the empire lost its political importance. Formally, it continued to exist, but in fact it was integrated into the centralized Nazi system. Assessment of a transitional period. The Free State of Prussia was an attempt to combine the Prussian heritage with republican principles. In the 1920s, it was temporarily possible to create stability and consolidate democratic structures. But economic crises and political radicalization undermined these efforts. In this phase, Prussia was neither the militaristic kingdom of past times, nor had it already been completely absorbed into the authoritarian structures of the Nazi state. It was a state in transition, between tradition and modernity, between a monarchical past and a republican future. When the National Socialists took power in 1933, this intermediate phase ended. The Free State of Prussia lost its role as a democratic counterweight. The history of Prussia entered its darkest phase. But for a moment, there had been an attempt to turn a state with a strong monarchical and military tradition into a supporting pillar of democracy. This experience remains an often underestimated chapter of Prussian history, a chapter that shows that Prussia stood not only for the military and authority, but also for a willingness to reform and republican responsibility. Chapter 14. Enforced alignment and loss of power in the Third Reich. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor on January 30, 1933, Prussia was still formally the largest and most important state within the German Reich. But his political independence was already severely weakened. The so-called Prussian coup of 1932 had disempowered the democratically elected government under Otto Braun and de facto transferred control to the Reich. What followed was no longer just a political crisis. It was the systematic dissolution of federal structures in favor of a centralized dictatorship. From the very beginning, the National Socialists strove for a radical restructuring of the state. Their goal was not a federal Germany with strong states, but a uniformly led Führer state. In this concept, an independent Prussia no longer had a place. The enforced conformity of the states. As early as the spring of 1933, the National Socialists began the so-called Gleichschaltung. Through laws and ordinances, the state governments were placed under the control of the Reich. Democratically elected parliaments lost their importance, political opponents were removed from office, administrative structures were realigned. In Prussia, Hermann Göring was appointed prime minister. As a close confidant of Hitler, he quickly took over central positions of power, especially over the police and security organs. Prussia thus became an experimental field of National Socialist repression. The state police, once a bulwark of democracy in the Weimar Republic, was transformed into an instrument of political persecution. Opponents of the regime, Social Democrats, Communists, trade unionists and later also Jews, were persecuted, arrested or deported to early concentration camps. With the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, Jewish and politically unpopular civil servants were removed from the civil service. The traditional Prussian administration was systematically ideologically permeated. Dissolution of federal structures. In 1934, the decisive step followed. With the law on the rebuilding of the Reich, the state parliaments were finally abolished. The states lost their sovereign rights. Their competences were transferred to the Reich. Formally, Prussia continued to exist, but in fact it had become an administrative unit without its own political decision-making power. Ironically, Prussia had been considered the dominant state in the empire. Now it was itself the object of centralization. The federal structure, which had grown over centuries, was replaced by the principle of coordination. Instead of state governments, Reich governors now determined policy. Party and state increasingly merged. The NSDAP took over not only political control, but also social organization, from youth associations to professional groups. Prussia in the Nazi state. While Prussia disappeared as an independent political force, its historical legacy remained ambivalently present in the National Socialist self-image. On the one hand, the regime resorted to symbols of Prussian military tradition, discipline, obedience, a sense of duty. The Wehrmacht staged itself as the heir to Prussian military history, invoking figures such as Frederick the Great and the image of the strong state. On the other hand, the old Prussian administrative culture only fitted into the chaotic power structure of the Nazi state to a limited extent. Where clear hierarchies and bureaucratic structures once prevailed, a system of competing responsibilities, personal loyalties, and ideological control has now emerged. The Nazi state was not a rationally organized bureaucratic state in the classic Prussian sense, but a network of party apparatus, SS structures, and state authorities. Prussia's old institutions were used, but at the same time undermined. Militarization and war. With the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, Prussia, as the geographical core of large parts of the Reich, once again became the scene of military mobilization. Industrial areas in West and East Prussia produced for the war, cities became targets of Allied air raids. The National Socialist expansion rhetorically tied in with Prussian military traditions, but ideologically it was characterized by racist and imperialist goals that went far beyond classical power politics. In the East, a war of annihilation began that claimed millions of lives. East Prussia became a frontline area, later also the scene of dramatic refugee movements. The historic core region of Prussia was transformed into a war zone. The end of Old Prussia. With the advance of the Red Army in 1944-45, the Nazi regime's control over the eastern territories collapsed. East Prussia was conquered by Soviet troops. Königsberg was severely destroyed. Millions of Germans fled or were expelled. In May 1945, the German Reich surrendered unconditionally. The Nazi regime had collapsed. Prussia, which had already been politically disempowered, now also lost its historical shape territorially. The Allies regarded Prussia as a symbol of a militaristic Germany. In their perception, the name stood for expansion, discipline, and authoritarian state. This interpretation was historically abbreviated, but it shaped the post-war order. A state without statehood. Prussia had already lost its independence during the Nazi regime. After 1945, it was de facto no longer capable of acting. Its territories were placed under Allied administration, reorganized and partly assigned to other states. The dissolution of Prussia was finally to be formally decided in 1947. But already between 1933 and 1945, the state had been politically gutted. A once dominant kingdom had become an empty shell. Ambivalence urbi. The enforced conformity under the Nazi regime meant not only a loss of power, but also ideological instrumentalization. Prussian symbols were appropriated, military tradition glorified, while the rational and reform-oriented aspects of history were suppressed. Historical Prussia had been much more than a military state. It had brought about administrative reforms, promoted religious tolerance, and founded educational institutions. In the Nazi state, however, little of this remained visible. Conclusion. Between 1933 and 1945, Prussia finally lost its political independence. The Gleichschaltung abolished federal structures. Central power was concentrated in the Reich. Prussia was continued administratively, but without real autonomy. The Second World War and the collapse of the Nazi regime marked the de facto end of a state that had helped shape European history for centuries. What had once begun as an order state, rose to a kingdom and dominated the empire had now become an administrative memory. The name Prussia still existed, but its political substance was lost. With the end of the Third Reich, it was not only Germany that faced a new beginning. The history of Prussia was also nearing its formal conclusion. The final dissolution was to follow in 1947, as a symbolic conclusion to a centuries-long development. Chapter 15, 1947. The Dissolution of Prussia, Myth and Aftermath. When the German Reich capitulated in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities had been destroyed, millions of people were fleeing, political orders had collapsed. Among the many historical turning points that this war brought with it was the final end of Prussia, a state that had shaped the political face of Central Europe for centuries. Formally, Prussia still existed as an administrative unit at this time, but it was already a shadow of its former self. Its eastern core areas, East Prussia, West Prussia, parts of Silesia and Pomerania, had been conquered by the Red Army. Millions of Germans fled or were expelled. The historic cities of Königsberg, Gdansk, and Breslau lost their German character. The geographical heart of Prussia was shattered. The Allies, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, were now faced with the task of reorganizing Germany politically. The evaluation of Prussia was of particular symbolic power. In the perception of many Allied politicians, Prussia was considered the epitome of German militarism, a source of authoritarian traditions and a historical bearer of expansive power politics. This view was simplistic, but politically effective. On February 25, 1947, the Allied Control Council passed Law No. 46. With this decision, the state of Prussia was officially dissolved. The explanatory memorandum stated that Prussia had always been the bearer of militarism and reaction, and therefore had to be eliminated in order to promote the democratization of Germany. This formally ended a political existence that had begun in 1701 with the coronation of the king, and whose roots reached back to the Middle Ages. The end of a state, not a story. The dissolution of Prussia was legally clear, but historically complex. For Prussia had long since ceased to be the closed state of earlier centuries. It had already been absorbed into the German Reich during the German Empire, but under the Nazi regime it had lost its independence. 1947 was therefore less an abrupt end than a symbolic end. The territories of Prussia were distributed among newly created or revived lands. Brandenburg, Saxony-Anhalt, and Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania were created in the Soviet occupation zone. In the western zones, North Rhine-Westphalia, Lower Saxony, and Rhineland-Palatinate were formed. East Prussia was divided between Poland and the Soviet Union. The northern part with Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, became part of the Soviet Union. The name Prussia disappeared from the political map. But could it also wipe out his inheritance? The myth of Prussia. Even during her lifetime, Prussia had produced a strong myth. The Prussian spirit stood, depending on the perspective, for discipline, a sense of duty and efficiency, or for militarism and authoritarian strictness. Frederick the Great, the soldier king Bismarck, they all became symbolic figures of a state idea that worked for generations. After 1945, this myth was initially viewed critically. In West Germany, a deliberate distancing from the authoritarian legacy dominated. In East Germany, on the other hand, Prussia was viewed ambivalently. On the one hand, it was considered a feudal state, and on the other hand, individual figures such as Frederick II were later portrayed positively again, albeit under socialist interpretation. Over time, however, a more differentiated view set in. Historians began to see Prussia not only as a military state, but also as a reform state. The administrative modernization of the 18th century, the reforms after 1806, the education system, all of this was also part of the heritage. Prussian virtues, reality or projection. The term Prussian virtues was often used. This meant qualities such as reliability, a sense of duty, thrift, and the rule of law. Some saw this as a positive basis for modern administrative culture, others as an ideological exaggeration. In fact, Prussia was never a monolithic state. It was characterized by regional diversity, denominational antagonisms, and political change processes. From the state of the order to the kingdom to the free state, it had reinvented itself several times. The idea of a unified Prussian essence was more a construction of later generations than a historical constant. Aftermath in divided Germany. After 1949, two German states existed on the territory of the former Prussia, the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east. Both referred differently to the Prussian heritage. In the Federal Republic of Germany, federalism was deliberately strengthened, also as an alternative to the centralist tradition. At the same time, the Prussian administrative culture remained noticeable in many areas, such as the civil service or the education system. In the GDR, Prussia was initially condemned as a symbol of militarism. Later, however, a cautious rehabilitation of individual historical personalities began, especially Frederick II, who was portrayed as an enlightened ruler. Thus, even after its formal dissolution, Prussia remained part of political identity debates. Culture of remembrance after 1990. With German reunification in 1990, the examination of history gained new importance. Regions such as Brandenburg or Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania reconnected with historical traditions, but without reviving the state of Prussia. Palaces such as Sanssouci or the restored Berlin Museum Island are reminders of cultural heyday. Historical debates shed light on both the reformist and authoritarian sides of Prussian history. Today, Prussia is no longer a political term, but a historical one. But its traces are visible in architecture, administration, educational institutions, and in collective memory. An ambivalent legacy. The dissolution of Prussia in 1947 was a symbolic act that ended with an era. But history cannot simply be erased by law. Prussia had shaped Europe for centuries, militarily, politically, and culturally. His rise from a religious state to a great power, his role in German unification, his reform movements, and his entanglements in authoritarian structures form a complex legacy. Neither glorification nor blanket condemnation do justice to this story. Prussia was both a reform state and a military power, a promoter of education and an advocate of hierarchy, a motor of unity and part of authoritarian traditions. Final reflection. With Control Council Law No. 46, Prussia's state existence ended. But the question of his influence remains. In modern administrative efficiency, in federal debates, in cultural places of remembrance, traces can be found everywhere. Perhaps the real significance of Prussia lies not in its formal existence, but in the tension between order and change, between tradition and reform, which runs through its history. From the pagan Prussians to the state of the order, from kingdom to great power and finally to dissolution, Prussia was never static. It was a product of its time and at the same time a creator of European history. 1947 marks the end of a name, not the end of an effect. Prussia's legacy lives on, not as a state, but as a historical chapter that still raises questions today, about power, responsibility, reform and the balance between authority and freedom. And perhaps this is precisely where its most lasting after-effect lies.